In today's video, I'm going to be going over some of the decks that aren't necessarily at the top of the metagame, but have the potential to compete with the best decks and are maybe a little bit more interesting or are more fun to play. So if you enjoy those types of decks, then this is the video for you. What's up guys, my name is Tcg Sam, and in today's video I'm going to be going over what I feel like are the most talked about rogue decks in today's Rage of the Abyss format. And before we begin, I'm just going to quickly go over the tiers that we have here. Strong meta potential, I think that these are like the best of the best rogue decks and can definitely do well at a big tournament with a skilled pilot and a little bit of good luck. Next up is hidden potential. I think that these decks are sort of just on the cusp of being a very good rogue deck, but one or two things hold it back and make it a little bit worse than some of the rogue decks in the strong meta potential tier. And then format dependent, I think that these decks would be good in very specific formats where certain conditions are met, like for example not as many hand traps are played and more board breakers are being played. And then finally, the only for fun tier, I think that these decks that go in here just aren't really that good and don't really have much going for them. So without any further ado, let's hop straight into the video. Starting off with Sword Soul, I think that Sword Soul is probably a very format dependent deck because of its low ceiling in terms of what it can do. I think in a slower format in general, this is a deck that could do well. The problem this deck has is that its end boards just aren't that good and are very easily played through by any competent deck. Now that being said, it does have a few things going for it in the sense that it can technically play through cards like Shifter and Droll fairly well, whereas other decks just can't do it at all. And it can do okay under both the Molcharmies as well, since it has quite a few ways it can just end on a simple like Chi and some hand traps, and probably have it be a fair end board compared to some of the other end boards that some of these decks would be forced to make under those cards. Next up is Mimighoul. I think that Mimighoul in terms of rogue decks are probably one of the best out there. It's able to play very well under a card like Shifter, and it doesn't really care too much about a card like Fuelos. It will lose a little bit harder to a card like Perulia because it does need to summon to your opponent's field as part of its engine, and plus Droll can hurt it a little bit as well. But that being said, I think that the Mimighoul deck is flexible enough to where you can choose to play a more combo version with like Kashtira and Fiendsmith cards, or you could dial it back and play more of a control version with just the Mimighoul engine and a bunch of hand traps. And I think that the engine itself is very strong because of a card like Mimighoul Dungeon, which can lock your opponent out of normal summoning. The fact that its engine is fairly competent and strong, plus the fact that it can take advantage of some of the most powerful engines like Kashtira and Fiendsmith, make it so it's one of the strongest rogue decks out of all of these in my opinion. Next up is Exosister. I don't think Exosister is a very good deck. It does have quite a few problems with being able to play through hand traps and interruptions, and it will struggle going second playing into boards because its engine inherently just doesn't have that many pushes. So I think that I'd probably have to put it in format dependent. I would put it in only for fun, but I think that it has one thing going for it, and that's that it can play Dimension Shifter, and we all know how good Dimension Shifter is, so I don't think I can put it any higher than this. But I think that in a format where more decks will play into the Exosister effects of moving stuff out of the graveyard, I think that Exosister could have some potential there, but outside of that, currently, I don't think it's going to be that good in this current format. Next up is Drytron, and I think that Drytron is a deck with some hidden potential. It is one of those combo decks that sets up a very powerful end board if it's able to go off uninterrupted, but it does have issues playing around those different hand traps like Droll, Shifter, and both Molcharmies. That's definitely something that will hold it back. But that being said, I guess one thing that does sort of keep it afloat is the fact that it has access to the rank 1 toolbox, meaning it has access to a card like Yugioh. Yugioh makes it so you're just going to be able to survive the turn if you get hit with one of those powerful hand traps. With the Drytron engine itself, you'd actually be surprised how much it can play through just because of how much advantage it can generate just by spamming out bodies on the board, using them for like Link material or Xyz material, and then using a card like Cyber Angel and Natasha to pick apart your opponent's board. So I think that it does have some potential, but it is pretty heavily hindered by those popular hand traps that are currently being played. Next up is Dinomorphia, and I think that Dinomorphia is in a similar boat as Mimighoul. Its engine itself is actually very strong, and the fact that it doesn't lose to any of the hand traps like Droll, Shifter, and Molcharmies make it so it's a very powerful control deck that a lot of the top meta contenders will struggle to deal with when it's able to go first. I think the biggest problem this deck has is when it's going second, of course, it is inherently a trap deck, and it doesn't do well into your opponent's interruptions unless you have something crazy like a Floodgate plus Solemn Strike or something to break their board, but that's not going to happen very often. So I think that for that reason, it can't be anything more than a rogue deck. But in terms of rogue decks, I think Dinomorphia is one of the best ones out there. Next up is Bystial Control, and I think that Bystial Control is in a similar boat as Dinomorphia. it is going to lose a little bit harder to hand traps like Shifter, for example, but it is able to play a lot more hand traps in its deck, and it is able to take full advantage of the Bystials being powerful interruptions as well as engine pieces. I think that this deck has the potential to be a meta contender because of how powerful the Bystials can be in certain formats. Not to mention, it is able to inherently play well under a card like Fuelos, because the deck doesn't necessarily need to spam out the board with anything more than just a simple copy of Bystial Lubellion, setting up Regain, and then putting up a Hermetic Seals in the extra monster zone. For those reasons, this deck is going to be a fairly solid meta pick, and it will be especially strong in formats where light and dark monsters are very prevalent. Next up is Dragon Link. I think that Dragon Link is a little bit of a step down from Bystial Control. You do add in a few more combo cards to allow you to have a much higher ceiling than Bystial Control, but I think the problem is when you're fitting in all those engine pieces, you're forced to take out some of those non-engine that would help you when going second against those meta decks. Not to mention, I think Dragon Link as a deck itself also will lose harder to cards like Shifter and Droll and Lockbird compared to Bystial Control, because the playstyle of Dragon Link is still as a combo deck. Whereas with Bystial Control, you have the option to pop off on certain turns, but you can afford to just play a slower game and just control the game with Bystials. Whereas with Dragon Link, you don't really have that option that Bystial Control has, since a lot of your non-engine slots have been dedicated to playing a bigger Dragon engine and more combo pieces. It suffers similar problems as Drytron, unfortunately, where it loses to those big 4 hand traps, but outside of that, I think it's a perfectly fine deck. Next up is Dark World, and I think Dark World is probably the definition of format dependent. This deck is crazy in a format where no one is playing that many hand traps, or hand traps like Droll aren't super popular, but it's going to get absolutely destroyed by any one of the top 4 hand traps like Droll, Shifter, or the Mulcharmies. However, that being said, in a format where board breakers are more popular, this deck can definitely punish opponents who aren't prepared for it and don't respect it. So I think that for that reason, it's just going to go in format dependent. It'll be pretty good in certain formats, but I don't think this current format is that good for it because of how popular hand traps are going to be. Next up are Sharks. That's pretty strong going first end boards, but it does suffer the same problems where it does lose to those hand traps. So you're going to see that's a common trend with these like hidden potential decks. The decks that are in here in hidden potential are held back by the fact that they lose to those powerful hand traps, whereas those in strong meta potential either don't care about those hand traps or have ways around it. So I think that with Sharks, their end board is perfectly fine if they are able to pop off, but once again, going second, its engine is a little bit lacking and it does lose to those powerful hand traps. Next up is Lightsworn, and I think that Lightsworn is probably a pretty strong rogue deck. The fact that the deck has so much gas means it can probably play through a fair bit, even if your opponent sets up a fairly decent board. That being said, however, it does have weaknesses, of course, where it's limited by cards like Shifter, Droll, and the Mulcharmies, and plus it's not going to be able to play much non-engine, if any at all, and I think that is a big problem with this deck. But the reason I'm putting it above these decks is because its engine itself is actually able to push through quite a bit, so you aren't going to be as susceptible to those lower impact hand traps as some of these other decks might be susceptible to. Plus, like I mentioned, you should be able to play through some boards going second as well. Next up is Crystal Beast. I think the only results Crystal Beast has seen is when Jesse Cotton piloted it. Then again, he's arguably the best player in the game, so I think unless you're him, you're probably not going to do super well with this deck. So I think I'd probably have to put it at like only for fun. I think that like the average player playing this deck is not going to be able to do well with it at all, and it takes someone of Jesse Cotton's caliber to be able to bring out the full potential in this deck. That being said, however, I'm not saying this deck's engine is terrible, because its spells are actually pretty good. The spells generate you quite a lot of advantage and offer the deck a lot of consistency, but I think the biggest problem with this deck is it does really heavily rely on playing those supplementary engines like Diabellstar, for example, or like Fiendsmith. So I think for that reason, I probably put it in only for fun, but I would be happy to be proven wrong if someone else is able to take this deck and play it at a high level. Next up is Plunder Patrol. I think that Plunder Patrol is similar to Sword Soul. It is able to play fairly well under the Mulcharmies because they can just easily set up a half board of just Blackbeard and ending on that. But the biggest problem I think with Plunder is that, once again, like Sword Soul, its ceiling is just too low. You can pair it with other engines like Adventure and Runic to make it a little bit better, but I don't think that those engines are enough to push it past this tier. It would take the format to be a lot slower in order for it to be able to compete, in my opinion, just because it is a little bit too fair. Now, that being said, there's nothing inherently wrong with the engine itself, I think, and it does have a pretty cool gimmick, so if you're into that, that's something you could choose to play, but for this current format, I just don't think it's going to be good enough. Next up is Dinos, and I think that Dinos is, once again, a deck like Drytron and Sharks that has a lot of potential. When going first, its end boards are some of the craziest in the game. Cards like Naturia Beast, like the Dino XYZs are crazy, like Logia and Dolka, plus like Ultimate Conductor Tyranno, still in a pretty insane card. But I think the problem is this deck does get blown out by Droll, Shifter, and both Molcharmies. Now that being said, however, this deck does have a little bit of a better time than some of these other decks because of the half boards it's able to make under those cards. You can still pretty much always end on a rank 4 Dino, for example, like Logia and Dolka, which are very solid interruptions, even under a card like Shifter. Plus, if you get hit with Molcharmy, you don't necessarily have to go into your extra deck that often. You could just end on like a single Xyz monster plus like a Ultimate Conductor Tyranno, and sometimes that can even be enough. So I think that this deck is probably at the top of hidden potential, but it is just slightly worse than some of these decks in my opinion. Next up is Traptrix, and I think that Traptrix is also a deck that should only really be played for fun. I don't think this deck is very good at all. Its full end board just isn't that good. The whole trap cards are just a little bit too fair. Like most competent meta decks should just be able to play through even a full Traptrix board of like 2 to 3 sets plus like Sarah and Rafflesia, and it definitely is also going to get cooked by the Molcharmy cards and Shifter as well. So I think for that reason I probably just have to put it in only for fun. I just don't think that this deck is strong enough to compete in today's format. Next up is Vanquish Soul. If you've seen my other tier list, you know I always trash on Vanquish Soul and always say it's not a very good deck, and I still sort of stand by that. Like, I don't think it's a great deck, but I guess it does have things like going for it over some of these like other decks below here. And in terms of a rogue deck, it is pretty solid. It is able to generate quite a lot of advantage at snowball very quickly, making it very difficult for a lot of decks to deal with. Not to mention it gets to play a card like Shifter as well, which is something that not many of these decks are able to do, and we all know how good Shifter is. The deck itself does allow for a fair bit of skill expression in my opinion, and I think a player who knows what they're doing with this deck and has a bit of a good day can potentially do pretty well at an event. So I guess at least in terms of rogue decks, Vanquish Soul is a fairly solid one. Next up is Marincess. I think that Marincess is a very format dependent deck. I think that deck is a little bit too fair. Just like Sword Soul, its full board is just going to end on like 2 interruptions plus like a bunch of hand traps. And I think that sort of playstyle is going to be okay in a format that's a little bit slower and that doesn't have as many of those crazy hand traps like Shifter and Molcharmies running around, because this deck can't do anything at all under those cards, whereas something like Sword Soul could even still end on at least 1 synchro monster. Whereas with Marincess, you really have to commit hard into your extra deck in order to even climb up to a point where you have end board interruptions. So I think for that reason, in this current format, it's just not going to do super well, and I think it would only really be good in a format that's a little bit slower. Next up is Six Samurai. With Six Samurai, it's pretty much the exact same boat as Dark World. It has the same strengths in the sense that it's just going to absolutely demolish you if you don't play hand traps in your deck, but it is going to suffer from the same problems as Dark World, where it's going to just lose to Droll, Shifter, and both Molcharmies. So overall, I think it's going to be similar to Dark World, where it just loses to those big blowout hand traps, but if it's a format where people aren't respecting combo decks like this, it could definitely thrive and absolutely destroy unprepared opponents. Next up is Heroes, and I think that Heroes is probably in a similar boat as the decks up here. It has a very strong turn 1 end board, but it does suffer from the same problems as these decks where it's not able to play through Droll, Shifter, and the Molcharmies. Plus the fact that its engine is so big means you aren't going to be able to play that many non-engine cards in your deck. And I think that's a pretty big problem in this format, because now when you go second, you're just pretty much always going to lose, especially because your engine itself doesn't necessarily push that well into end boards as well. So I think for that reason, it's probably capped at hidden potential, but the reason I put it so high up is because its end boards are really strong, and I think essentially if they're able to get to their full combo of something like Dark Claw plus DPE plus like a bunch of other things and a Dark Angel on your side of the board, it's going to be pretty hard for even the most competent meta deck to win. Next up is Gimmick Puppet. Same thing as Dark World and Six Samurai. With these FTK decks, they're going to be very good in formats where hand traps aren't that popular, but in the current format, hand traps are in pretty much everyone's deck, so I don't think that this deck's going to be able to do super well. Next up is Raidraptor. I think that Raidraptor is probably at like the bottom of hidden potential. This is a deck that had seen a bit of success like a few formats up, and I think that it will catch people off guard because not a lot of decks are prepared to deal with a tower spawn monsters, let alone 2 or 3 that this deck can put up. But that being said, I think that this deck struggles very hard into the Molcharmies because it can't make a half end board like some of these other decks might be able to. Like, you have to essentially full commit into either of the Molcharmies because all your extenders will like you need to summon from hand or deck, and you need to Xyz climb in order to even end on cards that will disrupt your opponent. So I think that's sort of the biggest problem that will hold it back. But in terms of a rogue deck, I think that it does have some things that it does pretty well over these other decks, in the sense that it can play through some of the lower impact hand traps fine, and its end board is going to be one that's going to be very hard for most decks to deal with. Next up is Goblin Biker, and this is a deck I don't really have much experience with, but from what I've seen, the quality of cards in this deck is actually fairly solid. The deck is able to set up some pretty powerful end boards with layer disruptions, and it does have access to the rank 3 toolbox, which can be pretty nice. This could be a pretty uninformed opinion, but I think it's probably like in a similar boat as these other combo decks. I imagine it will lose to the same hand traps and have the same issues with like going second, but aside from that, I think that this deck could be pretty solid, and maybe in the hands of a good pilot who knows what they're doing and has come up with something spicy for the deck, it could potentially do well. And then finally, we're going to talk about Madolche. I think that Madolche is also a deck with quite a bit of hidden potential. The quality of cards in this deck are fairly good. I think it's in a similar boat as the other decks in this tier, because it is also going to lose to those hand traps pretty hard. But on the other hand, like these other decks, their end board's pretty good, and I would say their engine itself is also pretty solid. So I think for that reason, I probably put it in hidden potential. I think it needs a little bit more of a push in order for it to be one of the stronger rogue decks, but aside from that, it is a fairly solid deck, and I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with playing this deck this format. So that's going to do it for this video. Let me know what you guys thought about it in the comment section below. I couldn't possibly cover every single competent rogue deck out there right now, but I wanted to go over what I felt would be the most popular and talked about rogue decks. But if you think I missed anything important, let me know in the comment section below. But with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.